last episode, we watched the West transform. Railroads stitched the country together, cattle towns boomed, and farmers pushed for power. The frontier, they said, was closed. But for many, the West was never empty to begin with. It was home, sacred, lived in, and defended. This episode tells a harder truth, a story not of building but of breaking, of what happened when two vastly different ways of life, one rooted in the land, the other in ownership, they collided on open plains, a story of resistance, betrayal, and survival. We'll walk through the experience of indigenous nations like Lakota, their vibrant culture, their fight to stay free, and how federal policies, from reservations to allotments, pushed entire communities into crisis. Welcome back to US History Understanding This Country, the podcast that explores US history with clarity, care, and just enough edge to keep you thinking. If this podcast has helped you see the past more clearly, consider sharing it with someone who might need the same clarity. A rating or a kind word goes a long way in keeping these stories alive. Let's begin with the root of the conflict, not new, but reignited: land. If there is one theme that echoes through American history like a drumbeat, it's land. Who claims it, who lives on it, and who gets pushed out. From the very beginning, from Jamestown to Georgia, from Trails of Tears to the Homestead Act, the story of expansion in the United States was nearly always a story of taking land. And in the West, that story came to a violent head. After the Civil War, as railroads opened new territories and settlers poured across the Mississippi, the hunger for land surged again. White Americans saw land as property, something to divide, fence, own, and farm. For many indigenous nations, the land was sacred, something you belonged to, not something you controlled. To the government in Washington, the solution was simple: relocate native people to reservations, open the rest for settlers, and keep the expansion going. But on the ground, that solution looked a lot like invasion. Treaties were broken, often with shocking speed. Land that had been promised to the tribes forever was suddenly taken back. Sometimes it was done with a pen and paper, other times it was done with guns. Many of the tribes who lived in the Great Plains, the Cheyenne, Comanche, the Apache, and especially the Lakota, resisted. They didn't see themselves as rebels, they saw themselves as defenders of their way of life, warriors, not victims. And so, as wagon trains crossed the plains and telegraph poles rose, conflict reignited. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not an unfortunate accident of history. This was a collision of two different worldviews. One that saw land as a gift to be shared, the other as a prize to be claimed. And in the middle of it all were indigenous nations trying to hold on to their identity, their dignity, and their home. You know, when we talk about Indian wars of the late 1800s, we often jump straight to the battles: Little Bighorn, Wounded Knee, the names of that echo through history books. But here is what I think we miss. Before we can understand why people fight, we need to understand what they are fighting for. And for the Lakota people, one of the main groups within what we call the Sioux Nation, what they were fighting for wasn't just territory on a map, it was an entire way of seeing the world. Picture this: you are standing on the Great Plains in 1850, the horizon stretches endlessly in every direction. No fences, no roads, just rolling grassland under a sky so big it makes you feel both tiny and infinite at the same time. This was home for the Lakota, spread across what we now call Dakotas, Montana, Nebraska, and Wyoming. But here's the thing that's hard for us to wrap our modern minds around: they didn't own this land in any way that we would recognize. They belonged to it. Their entire society moved with the rhythm of the buffalo herds. When the buffalo migrated, so did they. When the herds were thick, they hunted. When they were scarce, they traveled. Think about what that meant for a moment. Everything, and I mean everything, came from the buffalo. Your dinner tonight? Buffalo meat. The walls of your home? buffalo hide stretched over wooden poles in those iconic tipis we all recognize. Your winter coat, your tools, even the glue that held things together, all buffalo. They had a saying that captures it perfectly. The buffalo gave them everything except water, and for that, they were grateful to the earth itself. Now, you might think this sounds chaotic, all this moving around, no permanent address, but Lakota society was actually incredibly organized, just organized around completely different principles than European American culture. Families lived together in extended groups, led by chiefs and elders who earned their position not through inheritance or wealth, but through wisdom, generosity, and courage. When big decisions needed to be made, they would sit in a council and talk until they reached consensus. No rushing, no voting people down, just talking until everyone could live with that decision. And then comes their spiritual life. It was woven into everything they did. They believed in Vakantanga, which gets translated as Great Spirit, but it's really more like the sacred power that flows through all things. Every animal, every plant, every rock and stream was part of this interconnected web of life. They had ceremonies like the sun dance, where warriors would dance for days, sometimes piercing their skin with wooden skewers, all to ensure the tribe's well being and harmony with natural world. For Lakota children, education happened around the fire through stories that taught not just history but values. Young men proved themselves through vision quests, going alone into the wilderness to fast and pray until they received guidance from their spirits. Young women learned the sacred art of quill work and beadwork, creating beautiful designs that told stories and held spiritual meaning. Here is what strikes me most. For the Lakota, freedom wasn't something you had to fight for or vote for or write down in constitution. Freedom was simply how you lived, following the herds across endless grasslands, making decisions as a community, raising your children to understand their place in the great circle of life. So imagine what it felt like when, starting in 1850s and 16s, wagon trains began to cross their territory, then surveyors with their instruments mapping and measuring what couldn't be owned, then soldiers building forts to protect the roads and railroads that carved up their plains like scars. These newcomers, they brought more than just technology and numbers. They brought a fundamentally different way of seeing the world, one that said progress meant putting up fences, plowing under the grass, killing of buffalo, and dividing the infinite into neat little squares on a surveyor's map. When government officials arrived with treaties demanding that Lakota move to reservations, that is, specific bounded piece of land, it wasn't just a political negotiation. It was asking them to give up everything that made them who they were. Live in wooden houses that didn't move, farm the lands instead of following the buffalo, send their children to boarding schools where their hair would be cut short, their native language forbidden, where they would be taught that everything their grandparents had told them about the world was primitive and wrong. For many Lakota, this felt like being asked to stop breathing. So, when leaders like Red Cloud, Sitting Bull, and Crazy Horse said no, when they chose to fight rather than surrender their way of life, they weren't just being stubborn or violent. They were defending something they saw as sacred, something worth dying for. They were fighting to remain free in the only way that freedom had ever made sense to them. And that resistance, that refusal to simply disappear into American melting pot, that's where our story really begins. To the US government, reservations seemed like a tidy solution. Take native tribes off the land settlers wanted, put them in clearly marked zones, give them some supplies, and call it peace. But to the Lakota and many other indigenous nations, reservations were not peace, they were prisons. Imagine a group of people who had spent generations riding free across thousands of miles following buffalo herds, living by seasons. Now imagine telling them that they had to stay in one fixed spot, rely on government issued rations, give up hunting, and farm rocky, unfamiliar soil. That was what reservation system meant. And resistance came quickly and often. For some tribes, resistance meant leaving the reservation. Bands of warriors would ride off to hunt, to gather, to move as they always had. For others, it meant refusing to sign treaties or tearing them up when promises were broken, which was often. Even when some leaders reluctantly agreed to reservation life, younger warriors refused. They saw surrender not just as loss of land, but as a loss of identity. This resistance wasn't just emotional, it was deeply strategic. Leaders like Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and others knew that once the buffaloes were gone, once the children stopped speaking their language, once the old ways were broken, it would be nearly impossible to get them back. But the US military didn't see resistance as protection, they saw it as a rebellion. They responded with force by sending soldiers to round up bands who left reservations, attacking villages that were seen as hostile, and using policies that blurred the line between control and violence. Sometimes resistance ended in battles, sometimes in massacres. And yet, indigenous resistance was not just about guns and skirmishes. It was spiritual, it was cultural. It was about holding on to something deeper, a memory, a rhythm, a way of life that couldn't be fenced in. The most dramatic, the tragic clash was still to come. A moment that would become legendary, though often misunderstood. Custer's last stand. If there is one battle that echoes louder than most in the memory of American West, it's the Battle of Little Bighorn, better known as Custer's Last Stand. The year was 1876. America was celebrating its centennial, 100 years of independence. But out on the northern plains of Montana, another story was unfolding. One that would shake the myth of manifest destiny to its core. Here is what led up to it. The Black Hills, sacred to the Lakota and part of their treaty land, were rumored to contain gold. And once those rumors reached Washington and Wall Street, the US government, in its usual fashion, tore up the treaty that had promised the Black Hills to the Lakota forever. Prospectors flooded in. The Lakota pushed back, and the US Army was sent to force them onto reservations, with or without their consent. That's where George Armstrong Custer enters the picture. A former Civil War hero, Custer was flamboyant, reckless, and eager of glory. He led the 7th Cavalry into the hills with a mission: find and confront the Lakota and Cheyenne bands who were refusing to come in. But Custer badly miscalculated. He expected a small group of scattered warriors. What he found was a united force of more than 2,000 Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, including legendary leaders like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. On June 25, 1876, Custer split his forces and attacked, believing he could defeat them quickly. Instead, his men were surrounded, outnumbered, and outmaneuvered. Within hours, Custer and over 200 of his men were dead. To the Lakota and their allies, this was a moment of pride, a powerful defense to their homeland, and a message that they would not be moved easily. But to many in the East, Custer's death became a rallying cry. Newspapers called it a massacre. Custer was painted as a martyr, a fallen hero, and public anger surged. Soon after, the US Army launched massive campaigns to crush indigenous resistance once and for all. So, while Little Bighorn was a rare indigenous victory, it came with a heavy price. The government doubled down. Soldiers hunted down leaders, Crazy Horse was killed, Sitting Bull would be forced to exile. And in the years that followed, the Lakota would lose not just Black Hills, but much of their freedom, their land, and their autonomy. Custer's last stand wasn't the end of the war, it was the beginning of the final chapter. The tightening grip of forced removal, broken promises, and the desperate fight to hold on to the culture in the face of overwhelming pressure. After Little Bighorn, the US government no longer pretended to negotiate. It launched an all out campaign to force indigenous nations to reservations. No more middle ground, no more treaties that lasted for few years before being broken. This was now a full scale effort to remove, confine, and control native people, especially those like the Lakota, Cheyenne, Nez Perce, and Apache. These were the tribes who fought back with courage and skill. But even under growing pressure, resistance did not end. Some of it was military, like the Nez Perce led by Chief Joseph, who tried to escape to Canada with his people in 1877 rather than be forced onto reservation. They marched more than 1,000 miles, fighting skirmishes along the way until they were finally trapped just 40 miles from the border. Chief Joseph famously said, "I will fight no more forever." Their resistance was spiritual. In the late 1880s, a new religious movement called the Ghost Dance began to spread across Western tribes. It taught that if indigenous people returned to the traditional ways, rejected white culture, and performed the dance, the buffalo would return, the settlers would disappear, and the world would be renewed. To many native communities, the ghost dance was a message of hope and healing, but to the government, it looked like a rebellion. They banned the dance. They sent in troops, and in 1890, during a botched attempt to disarm a group of Lakotas at Wounded Knee Creek, things spiraled out of control. A shot was fired. Soldiers opened fire with rifles and machine guns. When it was over, more than 250 Lakota men, women, and children lay dead. Wounded Knee wasn't a battle, it was a massacre. And it marked a grim turning point. After Wounded Knee, large scale indigenous armed resistance effectively ended. The reservation system was enforced with military presence, and the government's attention turned towards a new goal, not just removing native people from the land, but removing native culture from native people. This next phase wouldn't come with bullets, it came with policies, school books, and plows. In a word, the goal was assimilation. That meant breaking apart tribal life, dismantling indigenous culture, and remaking native people into what the government considered proper Americans, Christians, English speaking, individualistic, and above all, agricultural. One of the most damaging tools used in this effort was Dawes General Allotment Act of 1887. On the surface, it looked like a gift. Each native person would receive a plot of land, usually 80 to 160 acres, to farm and own. After 25 years, they would get a full title and US citizenship. The rest of the land, the extra land, would be opened up for white settlers. But here is what really happened. First, the communal system of land ownership, central to many indigenous cultures, were shattered. Native people didn't think of land as something you fenced off and sold. Dawes Act forced them to live like settlers, dividing up the land that was meant to be shared, not carved. Second, much of the land wasn't suitable for farming. And even if it was, many native people had no tools, no support, and no experience with any kind of agriculture that is expected out of them. Third, the act opened the doors to massive land theft. Surplus land was snatched up by speculators and settlers. In just a few decades, native land ownership plummeted. Before the Dawes Act, tribes held about 150 million acres. By 1934, that number dropped to just 48 million. Alongside land allotment came boarding schools, institutions designed to civilize the native children. The most famous motto came from Richard Henry Pratt, founder of the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania: "Kill the Indian, save the man." Children were taken from their families, often by force, and placed in schools where they were forbidden to speak their language, practice their religion, or wear traditional clothing. They were given new names, their hair was cut, many never returned home. These efforts weren't just cruel, they were deliberate attempt to erase native identity at all. And yet, even in the face of such relentless pressure, indigenous peoples resisted, quietly, boldly. They kept languages alive in whispers. They practiced ceremonies in secret. They passed stories down in defiance of silence. The Dawes Act and the assimilation policies left deep scars, not just on lands, but on hearts, families, and memories. And by the end of 20th century, the effects were clear. Native communities were in crisis. By the early 1900s, the cumulative weight of the war removal, broken treaties, and forced assimilations had brought many indigenous communities to a breaking point. The numbers alone tell a grim story. Before European colonization, estimates suggest that millions of native people lived across North America. But by the turn of 20th century, after centuries of disease, displacement, and destruction, the Native American population had shrunk to fewer than 250,000 in the United States. But this was more than a demographic crisis. It was a cultural, spiritual, and generational unraveling. Entire nations had been scattered, languages silenced, sacred traditions banned. Children raised in boarding schools grew up distanced from their families, their roots, and their ceremonies. Many returned not knowing who they were or where they belonged. Communities on reservations faced extreme poverty, disease, and malnutrition. The land they had been forced onto was often unfit for farming, and the government support promised in treaties was frequently delayed, insufficient, or simply denied. And perhaps most devastating of all, many indigenous people began to hear the same lie repeated by outsiders that their culture was dying, that they themselves were a people of the past. But even in crisis, they endured. Through storytelling, song, and quiet ceremonies, indigenous elders kept memories alive. New leaders rose, from medicine people and midwives to warriors of the pen and law. Across the country, tribes found ways to adapt, resist, and begin rebuilding identity from their roots. This wasn't the end of indigenous story in America. It was a moment of darkness before a long and still ongoing struggle for justice, visibility, and sovereignty. Because indigenous history didn't end with the frontier, it didn't stop at the Dawes Act or Wounded Knee. It is American history, intertwined, irreplaceable, and still alive. The American West was never just a blank canvas waiting to be painted. It was a living landscape filled with stories, spirit, and sovereignty. In this episode, we have seen what happens when expansion collides with identity, when buffalo herds give way to train tracks, when treaties are broken for gold, and when cultures are not just displaced but deliberately dismantled. The story of the Lakota and so many other indigenous nations is not just one of loss, it is also of resilience. Despite war, removal, boarding schools, and broken promises, native communities found ways to hold on to their memory, meaning, and connection. Even in silence, they spoke. Even in crisis, they endured. As we move forward in the journey through US history, let us remember this land wasn't won, it was taken. And its original stewards are still here, still rebuilding, and still reminding us of the cost of forgetting. If you have found value in this story, if it helped you see this country a little more clearer, I invite you to share it. Follow, rate, or leave a kind review. Every ripple helps bring conversations ongoing. In our next episode, we turn to a different kind of revolution, the rise of industry, steel, and the roaring engines of capitalism. But the past, and those pushed aside by it, will still echo in the background. Until then, stay curious, stay kind, and never stop listening. Bye.